In this video, we're going to be discussing the third Lubavitch Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek of Lubavitch, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, not to be confused with the seventh Lubavitch Rebbe, who carries the same name and as his descendant. He was born in the year 1789 and he passed away in the year 1826. He was a grandson of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad Hasidic movement, Rabbi Schneerson of Liadi, as we've discussed in previous videos. And his mother was the Alter Rebbe's daughter, Devar Leah. Very fascinating story around his birth and youth. As we discussed in the previous video about Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradok, he passed away in the year 1788. The Hasidim in Russia did not find out until 1789 in that summer, and Rabbi Menachem Mendel was named after him. He was born in Elul in, I guess, around September of that year, right before the high holidays of Tishrei. He was born on Erev Rosh Hashanah, the day before Rosh Hashanah, and they named him Menachem Mendel after Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Haradok, which the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, considered his teacher following the period of the passing of the Maggid of Mezrich and the passing of his son, Rabbi Avram the Malach, which, as we discussed previously. In the next couple of years, Rabbi Schneerson felt, when he was in the 2 summers later, he felt that there was on high in the heavenly court that they were pushing against him for revealing so much Chassidus, so much Chassidic teachings. And because of that, he at some point he started to talk about it publicly, and that there was something going on, to the point where middle once of his giving a talk, he fainted, and he said, "I Rebbe Zayda," which was a Rebbe referred to his teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich, and Zayda referred to the Baal Shem Tov, who he considered his spiritual grandfather, his Zayda, which we've discussed in previous videos. And he fainted. And little Rabbi Menachem Mendel, who was 2 years old in that summer, he picked him up, and when Rabbi Schneerson opened his eyes, he sees little Menachem Mendel, and he says, Zeh Yenachamenu, this one is going to comfort us, play on words in his name. And that summer, Devar Leah decided that she was going to give up her life. Rabbi Menachem Mendel's mother, the Alter Rebbe's daughter, she was going to give up her life in exchange for her father's life, because she felt it was so important, her father's mission of teaching Chassidus and teaching these special teachings. So she went to 3 elder Chassidim, and she said, "I'm going to ask you to do something, but you must agree." They said, "Okay, it's the Rebbe's daughter. We should agree to whatever she says." And she says, "I want you to exchange my life and giving my years of my life to my father." And they were very upset, but they had no choice. They had agreed to listen to her, and they did so. And then on Rosh Hashanah of that year, right after Rabbi Menachem Mendel's 3rd birthday, the Alter Rebbe wanted to wish her a Shana Tova, that she should be, have a happy and healthy, sweet new year. And she said, let's not talk. She didn't allow her father to say this. And eventually he realized what happened, and she passed away a few days after Rosh Hashanah that year. And it was it was devastating for this young child who was 3 years old. Her husband, Rabbi Shalom Shachna, who was a son of one of the great students of the Maggid of Mezrich, a colleague of the Alter Rebbe, he was also devastated at his young wife passing away at such a young age with a small orphan. And Rabbi Schneerson took upon himself to raise this child himself. Eventually, Rabbi Shalom Shachna actually remarried, and he moved to his new in-laws in Karlin. So really, he was raised primarily by the Alter Rebbe himself. They even put his bed into his room. He actually slept in the Alter Rebbe's study room, his study. He also they used to play with him. He made these little tefillin out of potatoes. He took a potato, he drilled a hole in it, and he put a string through it. And when his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, would put on his tefillin, he would also wrap his strings around his arms with his potatoes, and he was having a lot of fun. And one time they actually saw that when his potato strings got all tangled. They actually saw how the Alter Rebbe was helping him and really put a lot of attention to this young boy, his grandson. Eventually, as a young man, they once saw him, actually he was a young kid when he was like 2 or 3 years old. They saw him, maybe he was older, I don't remember at this right the second. He was very young, and they saw him listening to a Hasidic teaching, and the Hasidim were like, let's get this kid out of here. And the Alter Rebbe all of a sudden stopped his talk, and he said, he hears. You'll see that he's listening eventually, and We'll get to the end of that story in a minute. And he really wanted to listen to his grandfather's teachings to the point where even the teachings he wasn't allowed, one time he hid in the fireplace when the Alter Rebbe was going to say a specific teaching for his son and some of his close students, and Rabbi Menachem Mendel was, as a young boy, was not allowed, and he was told he's not allowed to come. He hid in the fireplace, and basically they started stuffing wood into the fireplace because it was cold, and they didn't realize there was a boy there. And they like trying to get the wood in, it didn't work, and they lit the fire, and of course it caused a lot of smoke because the smoke wasn't going up the chimney, it was going into the house because it was being blocked. And eventually they found this boy here, and they realized what happened. And his grandmother said to her husband, the Alter Rebbe, and she said, "Why you're not allowing him? You see how much he wants." The Alter Rebbe said, "This boy must learn that to learn Chassidus, to learn Chassidic teachings, there has to be self-sacrifice." He eventually married his first cousin, the daughter of the successor of the Alter Rebbe, his oldest son, Rabbi Dov Ber, as we discussed in previous videos. He was 14 years old when they made the shidduch, and I think he was married. The shidduch might have been even younger. Eventually, he was married at the age of 14, as most of was common at the time. Most of the Chabad Rebbes did get married at a relatively young age. And at this point, he was very young. He was also very involved with the Hasidim and the teaching and guiding of the Hasidim as well, and writing down the teachings of his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe. When his grandfather was released from prison on Yutas Kislev, on the 9th day of Kislev, after being slandered by the Tsarist government, he actually took out a Tanya, the magnum opus of the Alter Rebbe, and he said, "Today is Simchas Torah." He banged on the bima and he did hakafas like we do on Simchas Torah with the Torah. He did with the Tanya. At a certain point, he was writing his own Hasidic teachings, and he wrote a treatise. I believe it was Sherish Mitzvahs Atfila. It was about what is the source in the Torah that of prayer. And he wrote a treatise on it based on Kabbalah, Hasidus, and revealed parts of Torah, the Talmud. And his wife found it, and the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, asked his granddaughter, which was both of them were his grandchildren. He asked his granddaughter, "Please, share with me what your husband is writing." And she brought it to him, and he was very upset that she had shared that with him. And he actually moved out of the house for a few months, and eventually Rabbi Schneerson himself had to get involved and reconcile them. In the end, they had a tremendous relationship. He relied on his wife for everything, and when she passed away, as we'll talk about later, he was absolutely devastated. So it just goes to show, how he overcame, as a young man, had a little bit of a crisis where he felt that his wife had betrayed him, and he overcame that to the point they had a beautiful, wonderful relationship. He was with Rabbi Schneerson, the Alter Rebbe, when he passed away. When they were fleeing from Napoleon, he describes how he understood what was happening. His grandfather was extremely sick that Saturday evening that he passed away, and he prayed the evening service in a very bitter tune, and his grandfather reprimanded him for that. And so we have that account of him describing that event. During the leadership of his father-in-law, the Mittler Rebbe, Rabbi Dov Ber Shneuri, as we discussed in previous video, he really did not want to be involved. He actually felt he did not want to move to Lubavitch, to the city where his father-in-law had moved, but his father-in-law told him, "Come, I'm telling you, I need you with me. I'm not going to get you involved in anything." And of course, the first thing he did was he got him involved in a lot of things. And when eventually, when Rabbi Doivber became ill, Rabbi Menachem Mendel was at his side. He was very involved in writing the halachic answers that came in. So if somebody would send a letter to his father-in-law, the Mittel Rebbe, would ask him a halachic question, it would be written by Rabbi Menachem Mendel, the answer, it would be approved by his father-in-law and be sent out. One time, his father-in-law was not in town, and he wrote the answer and he sent it back, and his father-in-law later pointed out that he had made a mistake in his answer, and he was devastated. And he said, "Don't worry, you are not yet a Rebbe," hinting eventually to his succession. When he was not there, he would he when the Mitzvah was not there, or he wasn't available, or he was ill, he had his brother Rabbi Chaim Avram would be involved in answering questions revolving health matters, physical needs. If they needed a blessing for a physical material thing, that would go to his brother. But as far as guidance of the Hasidim in matters of service of God, they would go to Rabbi Menachem Mendel. So he already appointed his son-in-law involved in many things. And again, even though he had promised him not to, eventually he became very involved. However, most of the mitzvah of his life, he did not attend the when he would say Hasidic discourses. As we discussed previously, the Mitzvah Rebbe, Rabbi Doivber, would say Hasidus for many, many hours. There's even a story of him saying Hasidus for 16 hours straight. Crazy amounts of time. His average teaching would be 2-3 hours, and he would say something multiple times over a Shabbos, and it was just it didn't work with Rabbi Menachem Mendel's schedule, and eventually he just couldn't go, so he didn't attend until later. I believe at the end of his life, of the Rabbi Doivber's life, he did attend some of them. He was also involved at that time, he was involved in Farbrengens. He would have Farbrengens where he would lead these gatherings of Hasidim and encouraging them, etc. That's something he was involved with as well. After the Mitzvah Rebbe passed away, Rabbi Doivber, Schneerson passed away, there was a debate who should be the successor. His son did not want, his brother did not want, and eventually it came down to his son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem Mendel, and eventually that year, about 6 months after the passing of his father-in-law, he did accept the Nesius, the chair of the Chabad movement on Shavuos. And that Shavuos, he actually said a Hasidic discourse, and this was the exact Hasidic discourse that we said earlier that Rabbi Schneerson, his grandfather, had said. That you'll see that he hears this discourse. He said it word for word. And one of the Hasidim who was there at that original story when Rabbi Menachem Mendel was a young boy, he's thinking, "Wow, what an amazing miracle!" And in the middle of the discourse, Rabbi Menachem Mendel took a break. The Tzemach Tzedek, as he was known, took a break, and he said, "Why are you thinking that I'm trying to impress you? My grandfather is standing here and telling me exactly what to say." And actually, that was something that was very common for him. He would have visions of his grandfather, even when he was awake, where his grandfather would come to him and would teach him some of Torah and things that he was stuck on. His grandfather would reveal himself to him many, many times. Eventually, he was one of his first things that he worked on as a Hasidic Rebbe was he was working on preparing the discourses of his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe. He relied upon his own writings, the writings of his uncle, his great uncle, I should say, the Alter Rebbe's brother, Rabbi Yehuda Leib, and the writings of Rabbi Pinchas Rezis, who was a very well-known transcriber of the Alter Rebbe's teachings, and he put them together and he printed a book called Torah Or, which means the light of Torah, and it encompassed all the teachings from Bereshis until almost the end of Shemais, and then later, eventually, a few years later, he was after the Russian government shut down many printing houses, Jewish printing houses. He was able to print a second volume called the Likutei Torah, which encompassed all of the teachings from Vayikra, the end of Shemais Vayikra, through the end of the year, including the discourses of Tishrei and the high holidays, etc. That was something he spent a tremendous amount of time on, and effort. His leadership was defined by many things. First of all, he changed a lot from his father-in-law's ways. For example, Chassidus, instead of being 2-3 hours, sometimes many hours long, it went down to like 30, 45 minutes. Much more reasonable, much more in the line of his grandfather. He went back to that. You have to keep to the words and to the exact language of his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe. He wanted that. So, for example, if he would say a Hasidic discourse, he would use his own explanations. But when his father-in-law, the Mitzvah Rebbe, when he would say an explanation, he would weave it into the words of his father, and therefore you didn't know which were the exact words that the Alter Rebbe had used. Versus Rabbi Menachem Mendel, he would quote his grandfather, and then he would say an explanation, which. So therefore, it was very obvious which part was from his grandfather and which part was from his father. And in a way, he wasn't really a chassid in the literal sense, or the, I guess, conventional sense of his father-in-law, I should say. And he really deviated from a lot of things. Again, as we said, he didn't attend the Hasidic discourses, and really he kind of was he received directly from his grandfather. He was about 20 years old when his grandfather passed away. He was a young man who had been involved in many things. So in the court of his grandfather. So he knew he had received, and he had directly from his grandfather. So he definitely it wasn't like it was a continuation of his father. It was more of a continuation of his grandfather. He also, as we'll see, he was under a lot of surveillance from the Tsarist government, and because of that, he really downplayed a lot of the royalness of the court. For example, they had a tradition of going on Lag BaOmer. They would go to the field. There would be these performances. His father-in-law had a choir and horsemen who would perform. That all stopped. Also, the Yechidus Tanz, which was a dance that after people would have a private audience with the Rebbe, started by his grandfather, they would do this tremendous dance. And it was a very regal sight, and that stopped as well. As far as what was he involved with during his time of his leadership? He was very, very involved with fighting against the Haskalah movement. This was the Reformation movement that came from Germany, was trying to force traditional Jews to abandon their Judaism. And they tried this basically by influencing the Tsar, and the Tsar didn't really care about Jews being religious or not religious, but he thought that maybe if you convince them to be less traditional, less religious, maybe he could convince them to convert to Christianity. And Tsar Nikolai was a tremendous anti-Semite. I was the Tsar at that time. So he was like, sure, whatever, Jews infighting, I love it. And they asked the Tzemach Tzedek to come to a meeting at Petersburg, and it was him and the leaders of the Misnagdish movement, of the opposers of Hasidim. As we talked previously, that fight had gone away very much in reaction to this Reformation Enlightenment movement. And they basically stood their ground. They said Judaism has to continue the way it was. We cannot change the way we teach children. They wanted to make many abridged kind of things, abridged Chumash, abridged laws, abridged Siddur, and that way it would be easier, they claimed, for children. They also wanted to translate everything into German. And the Tzemach Tzedek's reaction to that was, children in Russia, they speak Yiddish. They don't even speak Russian. So why are you translating it to German? They don't speak German. They speak Yiddish, which is not really. First of all, they don't read Yiddish in German letters and regular letters, Roman letters, whatever you would call it. And they're not familiar with this. This whole thing is a disaster waiting to happen. You're going to make it hard, and the teachers don't know how to speak German, and the kids don't know German. You're just going to confuse everybody. Eventually, he was arrested at that meeting 22 times for criticizing the government. He really put his life on the line again criticizing the Tsar, and the Tsarist government was a very frowned upon in the Tsarist regime. And eventually he was successful in many ways. However, the Reformation also was successful in promoting a lot of their things and making schools. However, it never became illegal in the Tsarist Russia for schools to teach in the traditional way, which really was his success in that. And eventually, because of this, there was actually constant surveillance. He had people who were he was under constant surveillance, and he knew about it. He knew that there was constant surveillance to the point where he had to really almost decentralize his activities. He was involved also with saving children from the Cantonist decree. We talked about previous videos how they would take children at ages of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. They would kidnap them, and then once they turned 18, they would be introduced into 25 years of military service, and again taking away from their families, from their education, from their communities. And these Jews would leave, service, and they were totally ignorant of their culture and their Judaism. It was a terrible, terrible decree on the Jewish people, and the Tzemach Tzedek was involved with saving children. They would say that children had died. They would say that they would move children from one place to another. It was a very complex thing, and he did it right under their nose. And even there were some of these enlightened people these were Jews who were informing on other Jews, and they actually were involved with business with his family members, and it totally went over their heads. And somehow he managed to run a tremendous network, even though he was under constant surveillance. Another thing that he was involved with that he really wanted was he wanted to get the highest civilian, I guess, honor you could say from the Tsar was called being a honored citizen for generations. And basically, he already was an honored citizen because his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, was given that title for his work in helping the Tsar defeat Napoleon. However, he did not have that for himself as honor citizen for generations. He only was an honor citizen. And what this would do would, first of all, it would exempt them from taxes. More importantly, exempt them from the draft, which was important for Jews to be exempt from the draft. So he felt that if he could do that, his family would be protected. Again, they had a target on their back as well, so it was really important. And they also would be exempt from corporal punishment. So he felt that this was also really important. As again, they were targeted, the Schneerson family. And basically what he did was that the way you would do it was if you established a farming colony for 60 Jewish families, I believe it was, or 50 Jewish families, then you would be able to get this honor. And eventually he did. And this is something that kept with the Chabad Rebbeim, the Chabad Rebbes. They all had this title throughout the generations, until obviously the fall of the Tsars and the rise of the Bolsheviks. And he also helped. By doing this, not only did he get this title, this Shadrin colony ended up being not far from Lubavitch, ended up being the yeshiva that was eventually established by his grandson, the Rebbe Rashab, was eventually established there as well. And it was a big help for many families were able to make a living by farming the land, and they had a little bit of parnasa, because again, it was very, very difficult for Jews in the Pale of Settlement to make a living. Another thing he was involved with was his teshuvos, his answers to questions that he received from around the world. He received questions all over Eastern Europe. About agunois was a big topic, about women who were trapped by the husbands were missing, they couldn't find them. It was very common back then in Russia, this issue, helping them find a way to remarry. He also would answer from other great rabbis who would consult with him, and those have been printed in Chuvas Tzemach Tzedek. The name Tzemach Tzedek, by the way, I don't know if we mentioned earlier, it's a gematria, it has the same numerical value as Menachem Mendel. And therefore, he used this as a pseudonym also, besides for his published works. He also used it. I don't think they were published in his lifetime, by the way, the answers, if I'm not mistaken. However, he became known as the Rebbe, the Tzemach Tzedek, by his successors. He did also use the name Tzemach in letters that he wanted to avoid the censor. So when he was writing to his Hasidim, again, we talked about how he had this network and trying to avoid the fact he was under surveillance. He would many times say, Rabbi Tzemach said something. And I saw a letter where he writes using the name Tzemach in relation to Kol Chabad that we mentioned in previous videos, how they were supporting Jews in Israel, which the Tzemach Tzedek continued from his father-in-law and his grandfather. And he basically felt that perhaps this would be something that could be used against him. So he found people who were to take his place in being in charge of collecting the money and delivering it to Israel. And in this letter where he describes this scheme, he uses the name Rabbi Tzemach, again referring to himself. He also was tremendous amount of learning Torah. He writes how he could sometimes stay 6-7 hours straight learning without break, standing up, sitting down all night. He had a tremendous amount of time that he spent on his personal learning. Eventually, he built a tremendous Hasidic court. The Hasidic court that he built, according to some estimations, he had maybe close to 1 million Hasidim. I don't know if that's true. Definitely hundreds of thousands of Hasidim. Again, at that time in Russia, there really was no other Hasidic Rebbes in the Pale of Settlement in that area. So all Jews in that area turned to him. And again, the fight between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim had died down. He actually writes a letter where he says that the reason it died down is because the opposition was because his grandfather was so great and his father-in-law were so great, so there was opposition. But by him, he's not such a great person, so there's no opposition. Obviously, a letter written in humility, just a fascinating little anecdote. But he built this tremendous court, and not only did he have a lot of Hasidim, he also had 7 sons. One of them passed away in his lifetime, and one of them moved away to Ukraine area, where by his father-in-law. But he had 5 sons at least who were living with him in Lubavitch, and they all had their own style of teaching their father's teachings, and they all had their own style of prayer, and they all had Hasidim who would turn to them for direction. So they had this. So when, for example, the Tzemach Tzedek would come, he would say a Hasidic discourse. All his sons would stand behind him. And that was already, a real regal vision. And he would say the Hasidic discourse, and then his sons each of them, they would have their groups. They all had their own synagogues, and each one of them, and they would discuss it with their people who felt attracted to them, and basically this tremendous court, a lot happening, and they had, again, like we said, a lot of Hasidim who from all over Russia who felt that he was their Rebbe. He had, like we said, he had 7 sons. He also had 3 daughters. His 7 sons, one of them passed away. Rabbi Yaakov passed away in his lifetime. His oldest son, Rabbi Baruch Shalom, was told not to be a Hasidic Rebbe, and the promise was the Yeshuva Heina, the 4th generation will return based on a pasuk in Bereshis and in Genesis. And sure enough, that he is the great grandfather of, or however many greats, of the Lubavitch Rebbe, 7th Chabad Rebbe, which we'll discuss in a later video. His youngest son was Rabbi Shmuel, who actually succeeded him in Lubavitch. His son Rabbi Yehuda Leib succeeded him in Kapust after his passing, and his son Rabbi Chaim Schneerson succeeded him in Liadi, the seat of his great grandfather. In Rabbi Schneerson of Liadi, he carried his name as well. Rabbi Yisrael Noach in Niezhin, and I think I got all of them. So he had this tremendous. I'm sorry, I forgot. I think there was one more. At any rate, he had this tremendous court, and eventually was succeeded by 6 of his sons. Oh, I forgot Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, who was the Rebbe, as we mentioned, in Ukraine and Avrush, but he was not really a Chabad style Rebbe. He was more of a Polish style Rebbe, and the style of his father-in-law, who was also married to their family, which we'll discuss in maybe a later video. At any rate, this was the life of the Tzemach Tzedek. His legacy, first of all, the name Schneerson that he picked in memory and in recognition of his grandfather, became the name that was used by all the Chabad Rebbes and still used to this day by descendants of his. He built this tremendous Hasidic court and really fought against and succeeded in fighting the Haskalah, the Reformation, the Enlightenment movement, and kept Judaism burning alive in Russia for many years to come. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, comments, something I could have said, should have said, please let us know in the comment section. We appreciate it. You can like, subscribe, do whatever you're supposed to do to help these videos reach more people. And we'll see you in the next video.